Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in just a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other Friday to explore a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
It's a story of a lovely lady. I'm going to stop there. The Brady Bunch. That's where we're starting today.
Dave, you have a lovely singing voice.
I'm no RJ Heyman.
The mellifluous tones of David Zoll.
Who is bringing up three very lovely girls. Isn't that how it goes? We're going to talk about the Brady Bunch, but before we do, I want to ask you to tell me how's it going.
It's good. RJ and I were both at a installation of a new rector, which is a
Celebration of a new ministry.
whatever the hell it's called. Our friend got made head pastor is basically what happened for those of you from the Southeast.
Rector.
Alex Large at Holy Apostles. It was awesome last
Well
night.
done, Alex. That's exciting.
That's
Well, we
fun.
don't do dedications, but why don't we dedicate this episode
Yeah.
to
Yes,
Emily
to the-
and
oh.
Alex Large
Yes.
and their new ministry?
Yes.
Well, anything else to say for yourselves, guys? RJ?
Here's a story of a man named Brady.
Yes, there you go. That's what I was looking for the whole time. I just wanted you to sing.
Girls of his own.
Get it.
This first article is seen different than what it seems at first. RJ, you sent this our way. It's from Medium, written by Joel Stein. And the title is, I Toured the Brady Bunch House and It Did Not Go as Planned. This is the author talks about having a very nice childhood, but a solitary one where he was a pretty anxious kid who was an only child until he was 8 and wanted always to join the California Sun Bradys who were never lonely. He writes, the Brady Bunch has been nostalgia my entire life. I only saw it in syndication, and it presented an idealized, squeaky clean, lily-white post-war past I never knew. As I got older, I consumed the nostalgia of the nostalgia, watching The Brady Brides, A Very Brady Christmas, The Bradys, and 2 Brady Bunch movies. The Bradys, to me, were always about the past. Then he goes and tours the new the house, which has kind of been restored, was up for sale, I guess, and HGTV bought it. My tour guide was 48, and like me, he watched the Brady Bunch from his suburban home as a kid. He had seen the finished house the day before and said, I didn't think I would get super emotional. I was not in a communicative family, particularly my father. I thought, wow, that, the Brady Bunch, is how a family is supposed to communicate. Seeing the house made something I really connected to as a child seem real. It was an arrival. And he talks about getting really emotional, being on the Brady Bunch house. This is not how I felt, writes Joel Stein. As his tour guide opened the dark wood doors, everything was perfect. Not just the layout, but every detail. Time hadn't been frozen, it was reversed. The first thing I felt, obviously, was old, due to the fact that I am old. My childhood was longer ago than I thought. Rotary phones, tiny television sets, small bedrooms, Carol Brady's negligees. Secondly, the 1970s were sadder than I remembered. I stared at the sad clown paintings in the Brady boys' tiny bedroom, at first wondering why boys would want paintings of sad clowns, and then wondering why my parents had a painting of a sad clown. The living room had a piece of art, presumably made by the kids, a framed wad of clay with keys pressed into it, and this was somehow sadder than a clown painting. Why had I spent all this time fetishizing the past? Why had all of us? He's exploring what we would call the dark side of nostalgia. He finishes by asking, is wallowing in nostalgia a way of avoiding the complications of the present? Forcing the Bradys to be children forever, was that a way of us forcing the United States to be a child forever? It's a very interesting article. This subject of nostalgia comes up, I think, a lot in C.S. Lewis very memorably wrote about it. It's actually some of, I think, his greatest writing is on this subject. But the link of nostalgia, childhood, longing, nostalgia, which I think literally is the etymology of it is to come home, homecoming. And in this case, Joel Stein is actually going into the Brady home. I mean, I grew up watching Brady Bunch reruns, and that was in the 80s. And he's talking about doing that in the 70s. But what about you? I'd love to hear what your relationship to nostalgia, what your relationship to the Brady Bunch is, or just simply this article.
Well, I'll start since I recommended it. I just thought it was interesting to think about nostalgia. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I think I say nostalgia, because we on the podcast have talked a lot about fixating on the future and the arrival fallacy. Thinking to yourself, if only I can get that job, get that house, get into that school, then I will be fulfilled and happy. And about what a trap that is, how it's just not true, that when you do actually arrive, then by the grace of God, you discover that it, someone once said, feels really great for exactly 15 seconds, and then you're sort of on to the next thing, and that is sort of suffering and discontentment is sort of a necessary part of human existence. But we haven't talked a lot about the past, about sort of fantasizing and as he puts it, fetishizing the past. And I think that's an equally powerful force. Like, I just hear people talk all the time, especially people who are like a little bit older than I am, about how much better things used to be. How everything's sort of going to hell in a handbasket, and if we could only get back to a previous state of affairs. And I always wondered, like, when was that? Exactly, and for who? Exactly, who was that time good for? And in my own life, I tend not to be terribly nostalgic, and part of that may be my own upbringing. My family moved us around a lot. I lived in I went to 10 different schools before college. And yet, even for me, I think sometimes there is this temptation to remember the past with rose-colored glasses, or to relitigate my childhood, or go back or relive it. But then I think about, was I really happy then? What was actually going on then? And it's not, then some of the nostalgia gets seeped away. And I do think biblically about it. What does the writer of Ecclesiastes say? Vanity, vanity, nothing new under the sun, in the sense that people have always basically been the same, right? The circumstances change, but people stay the same. And when I thought about nostalgia, and I read this article, I thought about the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and being nostalgic for their time in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At least we had something to eat. It's like, we were slaves and it was miserable, but forget that. It was better than this desert thing. But there is a sense in Christianity, especially in the Old Testament, where God does call us to remember, but it's not to remember nostalgically, it's to remember that he was faithful. Thus far has God been faithful, and in remembering his faithfulness, even in the midst of struggle, that gives us hope for the future, that he was faithful and he will be faithful. But then in doing so, we're called not to fixate on the future necessarily, or to dwell or romanticize the past, but somehow to live in the present. Because we know that God is faithful, and that we don't have to sort of get things sorted out or live in a fantasy world. We can live in the present, while still also, I think we do think about heaven, right? That there is actually a time, and when C.S. Lewis, I think, talks about nostalgia, he talks about these glimpses of this far-off country for which we were made, but we only experience momentarily here in the present. And so to recognize that someday all those hopes, aspirations, dreams will be fulfilled, and the fears will be put to rest. But it's not an earthly thing; it's a heavenly thing. But the best we can do in the moment is to live in the moment, and again, not to look forward or backward too much. But I just thought it was interesting to think about, because again, we've talked a lot about the future, but not a lot about the past, and maybe that's a symptom of us. We're all relatively young. Right, like I'm the oldest of us. I'm 43, sort of, I guess, approaching middle age, maybe. Hopefully,
You're
young at
there,
heart.
actually. But
thank you, Sarah. I appreciate
you're
that.
welcome.
But I'm sure we have some older listeners too, and I wonder how they think about, as the past sort of is longer now than the future. We might presume how they think about these things with regard to their faith. And anyway, those are my thoughts.
RJ, the past is longer than the future. Sorry, that was like, whoa, you're right. I mean, depending on how long I live. I have a lot of feelings about nostalgia. It's not something I enjoy, generally speaking, to the point that, like, I'm unsentimental about things I should probably be sentimental about as a mom. I had an experience a few years ago when we were near the neighborhood I grew up in, I was born in and lived till I was 4 in Nashville, Tennessee. And, my parents waited damn near a decade to have my sibling. And so that was like the house I was an only child in. And we pulled up, and my mother assures me the neighborhood has gone down, but it was already a little rough looking, just the house, in a way that I found really jarring, because those years when I was little, the memories I have from it are so sweet. When I was home the last time, I went for a run in my parents' neighborhood, and I almost had to stop because I know too many old stories about that place. So it was like, I remember, there's the one house you go by, they have too many kids. They homeschooled all of them. The children aren't literate. Hey, Mississippi. There's another house where the dad screamed so much. They were 3 houses down from us, and we could hear it in the driveway. There's another house that, my best friend's dad died when we were 14, and 4 years later, almost to the day, the new family that had moved into that house, that father died. And that's 5 houses down. I mean, that's like one street. If you go around the corner, there's the house that the really intensely, just backwoods family lived in, and their dogs killed my cat in the front yard. And the next day, the dad saw my mom out in the neighborhood, and he's like, "Hey, just want to let you know, we took those dogs out in the woods last night, shot them all in the head." So, I almost had to stop running because it was like these stories, like I just would see the front of like suburban Mississippi. Yeah, it's just like I can't breathe right. This is like too much to take in. So like nostalgia is really hard for me from that standpoint. But then there are a few things, and I love this idea of the sort of the C.S. Lewis vision of heaven, because one thing, and I haven't written about this because I haven't known how to write about it, but I've realized as I have gotten older that the memories I cling to that I'm nostalgic about feel very much like they're when I was really little, and they're all at my maternal grandmother's house when I would nap, because she was very into decorating in kind of like a country chic kind of way. No one is surprised. It's the Mississippi Delta. And her curtains kind of look like Dolly Parton's dresses in the 80s. Like they were just like this like really frilly, like cream-colored fabric. And the hum of like a giant window unit, because they still didn't have central air. And that moment right when I would fall asleep as a small child was like the most peaceful. And both my grandmothers are dead now, and I can tell you that when I need to like be calm and even prayerful, that's actually the memory I go back to. So I just think nostalgia is terribly complicated. I guess it has its virtue. Certainly in scripture, nobody's like, nostalgia's great. Jesus certainly isn't. But I don't know. I have so many thoughts about nostalgia. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of marriages get ruined, frankly, because of social media, because people have nostalgia about like old boyfriends or girlfriends. Like, I think there's, and then guess what? Like, he's 40 and probably not as cute as your husband, a real pain in the ass too. I mean, it's just like, I think nostalgia is not great. I don't know.
This is so interesting. It really is a really fertile subject. And I thought, why don't I read what one of his great paragraphs about it. He says that our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, to be on the inside of some door which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. And to be at last summoned inside would be both glory and honor beyond all our merits, and also the healing of that old ache. He talks about, the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located, or the house even would betray us if we actually went back to them, because it wasn't in them only that we found that sort of longing, but through them. And the longing is what's important. And it's the same longing that Christians feel towards the future, when every tear shall be wiped away, and the sort of New Jerusalem. The truest indication of that is the longing we often have for the past, or through some fleeting, we're actually not longing for the past. We're longing for some glimpse of joy and hope that we experienced in the past that is kind of irrecoverable. This hits me very close to home. People who've seen my office knows that it's surrounded by tokens of my childhood. I mean, I've just been getting really into the '86 Mets.
What?
That was a big
Daryl
deal.
Strawberry,
Me
Ray
too,
Knight,
Dave.
When I was a kid.
Yeah.
Gary Carter,
Yeah, I've got all,
Lenny Dykstra,
When I was
Now we're
home-
making
Mookie
fun of Dave.
Wilson.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it's all buried in there. Wally Backman,
Sid
it's just-
Fernandez,
it's,
Dwight Gooden, Ron Darling. I could pretty much name every
Bobby
player in the
Ojeda,
86
yeah.
Mets, but it's
Well,
neither here
for-
nor
for
there. It's
kids
neither
who
here
grew
nor
up in
there.
Whitney Houston. Okay, keep going.
people who grew up, boys especially, I guess, who grew up in the tri-state area in the middle of the '80s. That team were superheroes. And I was home. I was with my parents, and I went through a bunch of they had boxes of our old stuff that they wanted us to go through, and I found all these baseball cards. And my son is now doing little league, and I just am sort of overwhelmed. I collide with this in my past, and realizing it was a lot longer ago than I thought than it feels like inside me. And what am I doing by surrounding myself with these objects and wanting to put my Keith Fernandez, baseball cards behind my desk? I think I'm trying to reconnect with some sense of not the tri-state area or not the baseball or not athletics. I'm trying to connect with some sense of joy and transcendence and thrill that I felt as a child, not only with my inner child, but really it is a spiritual longing. It is very much a spiritual longing. And I think like any spiritual longing, it can lead you down the garden path into all sorts of solipsism and self-obsession and escapism, but it can also lead you into, that where true hope is found. So, I mean, I think that it can be a gateway to hope just as much as a gateway to despair and the feeling the past is irrecoverable. It can also be a gateway to hope. That's what I would say. Nostalgia is such a powerful emotion, and I'm particularly susceptible to it, I think, after growing up in the world at this point. And not having a home either, RJ. We moved around tons. And I don't have a neighborhood where I can go around and think about those things, Sarah. So
Well, you are lucky. But the other thing I want to say about nostalgia that's interesting to me when you think about space is that churches don't affect me this way. And maybe that is just me being like, Proverbs 31 lady for a moment, and I'm not telling the truth. But I'm trying to think about having been in a church, and I've been in a lot of churches that I was in as a child, and they never hit me with they never feel empty in the way that a house can feel empty when you expect it to give you back nostalgia. There's something about a church, and I wonder if in those spaces we're so much more dependent on God who's ever present, whereas in a house, you're expecting to see your mom when she was 42 years old or whatever. But it's just interesting to me when you think about spaces and nostalgia that churches, I've never been in a church that I was in as a child and been like, well, this doesn't feel good anymore.
Sarah, you being from somewhere, as you were talking, it reminded me, have you guys seen Orange County, that ridiculous movie with Colin Hanks and Jack Black and John Lithgow? And
No, I've seen the Housewives.
it's
edition, but not the
no.
movie.
It's exactly. It's good. I own it actually, and there's a lot in there about. The main character really wants to be a writer, but he thinks he has to escape where he's from in order to become a writer. And then sort of the cathartic moment is where he comes to terms with the fact that all the great writers have a very complicated and troubled relationship with where they're from. And he sort of needs to embrace that. And I think there's something really true to that part of me having moved around so much, there is a little bit of a sense of, when things get hard, I'll just go somewhere else. I'll just move on. But to be from somewhere and maybe even to live there as an adult and to be known in a scary way and to know things in a scary way, and that there's a depth there and a wisdom that comes with that I think doesn't come necessarily if you're more of a vagabond. And I think a lot of your wisdom and your humor and who you are, Sarah, you're from somewhere. You really are from somewhere in a way that I'm not sure Dave and I are. And I envy that about you strangely, although, you probably would say I shouldn't.
I mean, did you hear those stories about my neighborhood?
It is, guys, it is such a fecund, territory, the past and nostalgia, and I'm struck by it. I also went and saw the second part of the movie It this past week, and I don't know if people make a big deal of how scary it is, but the power of that book, at least, was always the nostalgia that you confront about childhood and growing older, and this kind of sense in which you're at a point and you're 12 and life is full of possibility and challenge and fear, and then you come back and you're 27 years later, and things have happened that are irreversible, and you didn't have nearly as much control as you thought you did, and yet there's still some sort of love that remains or something. I'm not sure it translated that well into the big screen in all the final analysis, but I will say that this next subject translates very well into every screen, it would appear. I'm talking about Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift, whose new record has been taking America or she's sort of back on top after what a lot of people consider...
After really hitting rock bottom, Taylor Swift
I was like, was she out? I'm so not with it, though.
Oh, yeah, there was 1989, and then there was the one where she looked all gothy, and that didn't do so hot, and then this new one. But anyway, be that as it may, we're actually not here to talk about Taylor's music. We're talking about this somewhat ridiculous article that appeared in the New York Times called Taylor Swift, Philosopher of Forgiveness. It's really by a man named Scott Hershowitz. And he's really talking about her philosophy of unforgiveness. Taylor is kind of...
Are they dating? Because when I was reading this and I saw her list of boyfriends, I was like, wait a second. Is this just her latest boyfriend and he's trying to bolster her a little bit?
I don't know. Taylor is it's hard to live out loud like that, but she definitely is not known for... She's known for revenge and, for kind of really calling people out, or that's what's sort of fun about her songs, and it's definitely what's appealing. Anyway, he writes, in an interview on August 25th on CBS Sunday Morning, Miss Swift spoke up about our culture's obsession with forgiveness. People go on and on about how you have to forgive and forget to move past something, she said. No, you don't. And then Hershowitz goes on to say, she's right. You don't have to forgive and forget to move on. And sometimes you shouldn't forgive or forget. You should resent. That's literally what was written here. You should resent. To see why, this is him writing again. Imagine that you've been wronged. Let's say Kanye West just busted up your big moment at the MTV Music Video Awards. That's what happened to Taylor. So what? Why not brush the dirt off your shoulder? Shake it off, right? The reason that wrongdoing sends a demeaning message, that shouldn't go unchallenged. That message is typically something like, I count, but you don't, Taylor. Or, I am up here up high, I, Kanye, and you are down there below. Or, I can use you for my purposes. When you resent, Hershowitz writes, you protest that message. You insist, if only to yourself, that you do matter. The alternative is to acquiesce to your own mistreatment, to see yourself as less than Mr. West, as someone he can push off stage. And if you see yourself that way, other people might too. Resentment is about self-respect, not just self-protection, even if though he does acknowledge in the article that resentment has a way of eating people alive from the inside. But then he says this, he says, but doesn't Christianity teach that people must forgive? Not exactly. My friend Len Niehoff, who's a full-time lawyer and part-time pastor, that should be the dead giveaway, recently gave a sermon on forgiveness, which invoked Luke chapter 17, verse 3. In it, Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, rebuke him. And if he repents, big if, forgive him. So if Mr. West sincerely apologizes, he rejects the message he sent you when he pushed you off stage. And once he rejects the message, you can release your resentment because your protest is no longer needed. Ms. Swift says she believes in forgiveness for people who, quote, have enriched your life and made it better. But she doesn't believe in forgiveness for everyone. If something's toxic and it's only ever really been that, what are you going to do? Just move on. To forgive, in her view, you must release your resentment for the right reasons. You must release your resentment because you see that you can repair your relationship. But what if you can't? He then gives us the example of a lawsuit.
This person is not married.
Us move forward, but without forgiving or forgetting. It's I think maybe an intentionally provocative bit of clickbait here, but it's interesting in what it brings up about our default understandings of forgiveness, and of course the way he conveniently quotes Jesus about that and not 70 times 7 or him forgiving people from the cross. I mean, it's talk about proof texting in a very kind of lazy way, but your initial responses before I weigh in.
First of all, I totally agree. We should be allowed to resent people for as long as we want, and we should not have to forgive them. I'm 100% on board with this message. Unfortunately, it is very much at odds with the Christian life. But in my wildest dreams, I do exactly what she's doing, and I don't give a damn who I hurt. I have a list. Literally, it's a file I keep. I'm just kidding. But it's got 4 or 5 people on it.
Hit list.
Who I'm never going to exactly say a list. I would key your car if I was 14. These are the people on the list. And I'm probably not going to get over being mad at them. And also, I know that I am called to forgive them, and I am called to move past that pain. And also, I know that Jesus loves me and loves them regardless of how well I can work that out on this earthly plane. And I take a lot of comfort in that. And there's a tension you live in, because it means that you actually don't get to live in this righteousness of I'm right and they hurt me. You are actually living in this tension of I still don't like that person. I don't want to forgive them, but I know that I'm called into that. And I think that's on some level, that's the tension of being Christian. Probably the thing that's so scary about reading this is not forgiving and not coming to terms with this stuff. It's so destructive to other people. It's so destructive to yourself. So I'm kidding initially, but this is pretty upsetting to read. And then the last thing I just want to say, and I promise this is not an episode about Sarah's boyfriends, but
the episode about Sarah's boyfriends.
As I've gotten a small amount of prominence in writing and speaking, I have gestured towards old stories about things that happened. And I guess a year or two ago, I posted something about waiting for a boy to pick me up for prom. It was my junior year in May, not that I remember what I was wearing or anything. And he showed up really late. And then, so that was incredibly painful and embarrassing. And then as soon as prom was over with, he promptly dropped me off at my house. And I later found out that was because he was on probation, which I didn't know at the time. But anyway, all this is to say I put something funny up online about that thing that had happened. Because I'm still pissed at him about that, which is so silly. I'm a married woman now, but I'm still mad about it. And he sent me this really long apology.
Wow.
Yeah. He said, I remember that, and I feel so awful about it, and I'm so sorry that I did that. And, I was a stupid kid, and I felt really shitty. I'm sorry. I don't know if we say that word freely here, but I felt because I do, because I felt like the thing that Taylor Swift is demanding and the thing that we all think we have to have, which is these people to apologize to us in the right way for the way that they treated us wrong. When those people do that, you realize actually how powerless they were over the sin that they committed against you. You realize how much they are suffering because of what they did, and perhaps how much they're suffering even now because of who they are. And you don't feel any better. So, I know that that's like a really small sort of, thing that happened. And people always, whenever you talk about this, they always bring up really horrible, horrible sins that we commit against each other as human beings. They bring up murder. They bring up rape. They bring up all this kind of stuff. Well, are you saying I have to forgive? And I'm like, I'm not talking to you. Okay, I'm talking to the lady in the parking lot who got mad at the other. You know what I mean? I'm talking that's that. Whenever we do that as Christians, whenever we want to bring up these global things, that is our way of not dealing with our own repentance and our own hearts. That is our way of not dealing with the day-to-day struggle of being a redeemed sinner.
Amen.
Because we don't want to face that. So we just bring up global things that are on Time Magazine to push the whole conversation of forgiveness and repentance completely off to the side.
Gosh, I wish that weren't true, but that is, I think, couldn't be more true. But RJ, I want to hear from you before I weigh in.
Well, it reminds me of a student minister I worked with once said, and she was struggling to forgive, and she said, I think I've said this before, that refusing to forgive is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. And that's actually true. And what's interesting about your example is I feel so often the people we need to forgive, they could care less, if we have, like they've moved on, like they're not thinking about it. Now, clearly that ex-boyfriend had not, and maybe that was a healing.
Well, I'm good as gold. I mean, I'm the one they remember forever, RJ. So what can I say?
The one
Breaking
that got
hearts
away.
nationwide.
I'm the one that got away.
But
Poor
this
Josh. Okay,
this
keep going.
article reminded me, did I talk about one of the most amazing, thought-provoking, memorable podcasts I've heard recently, episode, it's a few years old, The End of Empathy on Invisibilia, and about how Western civilization, really since mid-20th century, and farther than that, has really been fixated on empathy, and that empathy is a good idea, and that empathy is the way forward, and empathy is the way to maintain social harmony. It's just sort of best for everyone involved. And about how recently that's really come under assault. And there are quite a few voices in our culture that are saying no, like we're done being empathetic. And in fact, we want to hold on to our anger and hold on to our resentment because it motivates us to make the world into a quote unquote better place. And it was fascinating. So I encourage you, if you haven't, like I said, Invisibilia, The End of Empathy, it was terrifying. It was terrifying, actually. But I see it. I see our culture. People are done listening to each other. And they're done exactly what you said, Sarah, that they're done being like, well, this was something that person did that they had very little control over, and they were a stupid kid and they made a mistake. And maybe they're not apologizing in exactly the right way, and maybe they haven't come to terms with it in exactly the way I would want them to. And until they do, and the world changes and everything gets better, I am not going to forgive. And it's terrifying. It's horrifying. And I'm not a big one to be like, we're moving into a post-Christian world, and I don't know. Those kind of conversations are not terribly compelling, and yet
Nostalgia.
Well,
Nostalgia.
yet, if we do actually move into a place where things like Christian values, like empathy, forgiveness, reconciliation, mercy, cease to infuse our culture, because those were not virtues in the pre-Christian world. Like those are not virtues of the Greco-Roman.
I put that on the site.
Yeah, though things were bad. Things were really, really bad. Women were treated terribly, and children were left to be exposed, and might made right. Like might really made right. And then Jesus comes along and says, nuh-uh. Those of you who would be first to be last and servant of all, because the Son of Man came not to be served, but to be served, and it changed everything. That's scary. It's scary. So yeah, ugh. Yeah, you don't need to forgive. You're right, but welcome to the rest of your miserable life. And good luck being married or having children or being in a relationship with absolutely anyone, including yourself.
The wedding vows, the prayers at the wedding, of the Book of Common Prayers, lead us to seek each other's forgiveness and yours when we hurt each other, not if, when we hurt each other.
Marriage vows, amazing.
And that's the real problem with this understanding of forgiveness, that forgiveness only extends to those who've asked for it in the right way, or when it's coming for the right reasons. Now, the command to forgive is the law, and you've just got to forgive me. We'll never get anyone to forgive you. But what does, I think, open the floodgates of forgiveness is and what's totally missing in this article is, what about when you're on the other side of the person who needs the forgiveness? It assumes that it's a zero sum, I guess, or that you're always going to be the person who's done unto. And
that's interesting. It does,
and partly,
100%.
And Taylor, one of the reasons why her songs, that they kind of play to our self-righteous, empowerment thing, and some of them, I mean, they're extremely catchy. I'm a fan of her music, but I would say that if I want to feel I'm the master of my own domain and no one can tell me what to do,
I'm right.
Pump up some of those anthems, and I want to say, well, what about when you need the forgiveness? What about you are the person that has been toxic in the other person's life? And that's all of us. I really do think it is all of us. Maybe part of growing up is figuring that out in maybe really painful ways. I think CJ wrote about it on the website, and he says, from a Christian perspective, the question not is what should I do, but but what if I can't do what I know I should do? And advice like you should resent leaves us empty-handed when we become the injuring party, the person who does the injuring, which we all will at some point, if that's not already the case. And sort of what the Christian injunction to forgive is both the law, but it is also the beauty of the gospel is that God is in the business of forgiving people, even those who do not ask for it for the right things or in the right ways, and that his like absolution is not contingent on us unlocking the door with the right prayer or the right formula. And in fact, it's really it's contingent. It's non-contingent. It's contingent on Christ alone. And that's a scary thing because it robs us of our entitlement, but it also, I think, creates love and forgiveness. And those are the only things that allow us to live in the world without just going insane or harming ourselves. And that's the next, the
Seamless
next
segue, David Zoll.
The next and final article is about the age of American despair. Now, we talk about this quite a bit on here, but we'll continue talking about it as long as it seems to be incredibly important. Ross Douthat in the New York Times wrote about the sudden rise in, deaths of despair, which is deaths from suicide, alcohol, and drug abuse that have increased so dramatically since the turn of the millennium. A new report from the Senate's Joint Economic Committee charts a doubling of the amount of deaths of despair from 22.7 deaths per 100,000 Americans in 2000 to 45.8 per 100,000 in 2017. Then he sort of goes through the reasons, and he puts it in the mouths of various Democratic presidential candidates. He said maybe there's some would say frame it as a mental health crisis and the matters of drug regulation, especially fentanyl and opioids, and that's really what's going on here. More addictive drugs, that made more easily available. Some would say it's a result of depths of despair, a result of economic factors, of stagnant wages or outsourced jobs. And then others would say that it's a result of a spiritual void in America, loss of meaning and metaphysics, and a total darkening of the metaphysical horizon. Where it seems maybe everything is playing a factor. But here's Douthat's conclusion. He says, the simultaneity of the different self-destroying trends is a brute fact of American life. And that simultaneity does not feel like just a coincidence, meaning all of the above, the economic, the mental health, the drug, the spiritual. Does not feel like just a coincidence, especially when you include other indicators such as collapsing birth rates and declining marriage rates and decaying social trust. They all suggest a society suffering from a meaning deficit, a loss of purpose, optimism, and direction, a gently dehumanizing drift. Then he finishes by saying, despair as a sociological phenomenon is rarely permanent. Some force or forces will supply new forms of meaning eventually. And it matters not only that this happens, but which forces those will be. Now, this takes on added urgency right as we were collecting articles. Another megachurch pastor, Jared Wilson, who's in Nashville, I believe, there were news that he was a huge mental health advocate and did what sounds like a lot of great work. And he died by suicide himself, leaving a wife and 2 children, I believe. And in fact, 2 days before, he had not only buried someone who had killed themselves, but he had tweeted saying, loving Jesus doesn't always cure suicidal thoughts. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure depression. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure PTSD. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure anxiety, but that doesn't mean Jesus doesn't offer us companionship and comfort. He always does that. It's a lot to take in. It's a very dangerous thing to draw any sort of one-to-one causalities, and yet to ignore the increase, that all things being equal, things have changed in this regard. I think I feel duty bound to bring it up as much as unpleasant as it is. Now, the two of you, deaths of despair, spiritual crises, loss of meaning, as well as sort of the religious, the Jesus component here. What are you processing?
I mean, I very rarely tell people what they should preach about on Sunday morning. But I do think the other thing just worth noting is that Jared killed himself, and the next day was Suicide Awareness Day. I do think that so this week happens to be the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. And frankly, what Jared posted on Twitter, and that gives you a way in as a preacher to really talk about despair and mental health with your congregation, which I'm just not sure we do enough of, to be honest with you. I think we really like to talk about the top 4 stories on public radio, but I think, which just heads up, folks, just makes people feel more in despair. But I think we're very hesitant to really face this stuff in our congregation, which is unfortunate because that's precisely, in some way, what church is for. It is for people to hear the hope of the gospel. I mean, we have walked with friends through the journey of them being checked into a psychiatric hospital for 3 months. And if you've ever done that, if you've ever been that person, been married to that person, loved a person who's been through that, you're basically showing up with McDonald's and listening to them talk about how sad they are. And the last thing that you need to do is go on and be like, but the hope of Jesus, because that's not going to actually help. Actually, you sitting there and listening, I think, is probably the best thing you can do, and to pray for them. I just think this whole thing, I mean, it's one of those things for me that's incredibly complicated. I mean, I've said so many times, we have 2 suicide-related deaths frankly, just in my mother's family. I mean, it's, and then a lot of addiction on the other side. So I hesitate to be like, here's the prescription, right? I mean, it's obvious that we know that people are hitting this kind of different level of low. And I think what scares me is that I do think people are trying to look for meaning, but I, #seculosity, get a little nervous about what that meaning is starting to look like in different people's lives, right? Because I do think we make meaning out of, exercise, or, I mean, I'm in a college situation, academic work, or all these different things, and then they can't meet us. They can't meet our suffering. They just can't. They can't meet our suffering the way that hopefully the church meets our suffering, and certainly Jesus meets our suffering. So I don't know, RJ. I ain't got nothing really.
You got a lot. You got
what do you have?
Plenty.
Well,
it's funny when we were talking earlier this week about what to talk about, and I think Sarah, you said we've got to talk about this pastor, and I was like, suicide? Sign us up, Mockingbird. We're all suicide all the time, which is bleak, and I'm sorry, that's kind of an awful thing to say, but I'm trying a little levity, but
well, it's important. We are one of the only Christian organizations.
No, but I was going to say, it's been present in my life this week.
Yeah.
This week on Monday, I went to the celebration of life for a woman who killed herself, and her children and grandchildren were there, and it was beautiful, and she was an amazing woman who lost her battle with mental illness. Tonight, I'm going to hear a talk given by a man who's a pretty prominent public figure whose son committed suicide. This week on the Talking Bird modcast, actually my talk from the conference in Charlottesville 6 years ago, a Sovereign Bullet. Audio quality is not great, but I've gotten a bunch of emails to me about that because I talk about suicide. So it's been very present. But I think, Sarah, at the end there, in my opinion, you really hit the nail on the head. That I think you're right. It's not about finding meaning or optimism. I think it is about coming to terms as a culture again, because this is one thing I do think we may have actually lost, with the reality that suffering is a completely inescapable part of the human experience, and there is nothing you can do about it. No amount of work or money or education or professional achievement or working out or substances or whatever you think is going to exempt you from suffering it's not going to work. And we've tried everything we can. We've pushed death to the side. I'm sitting next to the medical center. We have places we send people to die because we don't want to watch it anymore. And that's something we as a culture need to come to terms with. And even in that, I really do, like Dave, your dad used to say, sometimes you don't even need to preach the gospel, you just need to resonate with people's pain and their sin, and that's enough gospel. Just to feel like someone is saying, you are not alone. We as a culture have done so much, we think to ourselves, why do I feel this way when I have so much? When things are going so well, I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't be suffering. I shouldn't have these thoughts. And that just drives you deeper and deeper and deeper in despair. And no one wants to talk about it. And you're right, Sarah, they certainly don't want to talk about it from the pulpit because people want to come to church and they want to leave feeling uplifted, but it's superficial.
Or challenged.
But it's superficial.
Like.
It's superficial. It doesn't.
No, it is. But I mean, I hope I'm not sure that most pulpits in our denomination, to be honest with you, are hoping for uplift. I think that they always want to challenge people. And I'm like, oh my God, everyone has walked in on the brink of like
let me challenge you to confront the reality of your life and the reality of the inescapable reality of our existence. And then maybe in the midst of that, Jesus has a word to speak, which is, you are not alone. I love you, I forgive you, I am with you, and this is not forever. This is not for, and
I mean, and that's not RJ's word to you. That's Jesus' word. I mean, when we read the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin, the sheep doesn't. It says, there's all sinners who repent. There's more joy in heaven. But in the actual parable, that sheep is headed off a cliff. That coin can't move. It's an inanimate object. The hope is in God. The hope is in Jesus, who grabs the lamb, puts it over its shoulders, and walks back. And maybe it is sheep are long since we think that's suicidal. Now that's not my conviction all the time about how God acts in the world, but it seems to be the picture of what Jesus is saying. And he's more trustworthy than I am. So that's where I'm going to hang my hat, is that beautiful picture of a God who goes after the lost, the least, the lonely, the last, which is everyone. Again, the wonderful thing about that parable is that it's a rhetorical device, because you read it and everyone's like, am I the only one? There are no 99. We're all the lost sheep, and that means that we're all the target of God's. But we think there are.
We think they're the other 99. That's what we feel so alone. We feel so alone.
I feel like they're all blonde. Don't you feel like they're all blonde? Every time I say that, I'm like, just a bunch of blonde sheep.
Hey, well, I have blonde children, and they're let me tell you how lost a little. they're pushing the limits as we speak.
That's amazing. One thing I just want to say that I wish people would stop doing around suicide, and even frankly just around mental illness, is that we all say, like, when you hear that someone took their own life, we all hear people say, well, first of all, everyone wants to know how they did it, right? Like, how did they do it? So, like, I can actually not end up with my garage with stuff, in the tailpipe or whatever. Or they want to know why they did it. And I always find that that's such on some level, I think people ask those things because they care, but I think on another level, it's because we're just like, we want to disassociate ourselves and our problems as much as possible with whatever happened to that person, so it for sure doesn't happen to us.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's just like, no, like this is like they woke up and their brain chemistry was completely off. Like that's what happened. Or they woke up and they were so sad they felt like they could not go on for another 5 minutes. And like they did nothing. This
is why the biblical image of being possessed is so powerful.
Yeah.
It's an actual possession.
Yeah.
And that's, someone who's in unceasing emotional pain wants it to end, and they also want to spare their loved ones it. I mean, isn't when we talked about that recently? I mean, a lot of times people, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was in Jared Wilson's mind, that he was sparing those who had to deal with him. That in fact, it was seen as a selfless act rather than a selfish one. And this is where we get into sort of compassion, and we get into, I think that when people want to read through the passages of exorcisms in the New Testament, you just want to say, no, let's focus in on those, because how many of us are beset by things that wish us harm that we don't seem to be able to get a handle on and can't even really make sense of. And the language that we use might have changed, or our cultural, comfortability with it. But how's that cultural, framework serving us? Not super well when it comes to stuff like this.
Meanwhile, there's just like a whole herd of 99 Taylor Swifts over there just going, resentment's great, just to name it. Like, this stuff is so connected.
There's a great book, I shouldn't say it, I haven't read it, but I've given it to people that I know are struggling with mental illness, and they've said that it was one of the best books they ever read on the topic. It's called Grace for the Afflicted. It's written by Dr. Matt Stanford. He's an amazing Christian man and a neuroscience PhD. And it's called A Clinical and Biblical Perspective. And he talks about mental illness, but he also talks about the Bible and about how there are many biblical figures that you read what they wrote or you see how they lived, and they had sort of diagnosable mental illness, that this is not a new thing. And for anyone who's read the Psalms, like David had his ups and downs, let's say, among other people. So if you're in that place, Grace for the Afflicted, Dr. Matt Stanford, might be a good read if you're trying to integrate your experience with your faith.
So what you guys are saying is we don't need to turn church into Brady Bunch. I think that's the
full circle. You're on fire today, David Zoll.
There is no neat way to wrap this one up. This is, again, something we'll return to over and over again. This is we've, I think, exhausted our time limit for today. But let me just say, in closing, though, Lord have mercy. This is
Christ have mercy.
The hope of the hopeless. That's
Lord have mercy.
And for that family as well as all people. So you guys, thanks for being here today, and we'll talk to you in a couple weeks.
Love you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by the Narrativo Group, and if you like what you've heard, please do drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. Until next time.